Hello and welcome. My name is Danish Bhatti. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Neurological Sciences at University of Nebraska Medical Center. And I am here with Professor John Bertoni, MD, Ph.D., who has a unique background in both clinical care and research in medicine. And the purpose of this talk, to sit down with him, is to review some basic information as a guide for medical students to get started with research, or even residents or trainees who have not had any background in research before and they're struggling with how to get their foot in the door, to get them an idea of what is research, what's the landscape of research, what are the types, how to get started, and other tips and tricks which are practical and useful. So this will not be a comprehensive review of the research itself, but only very practical and relevant information for a medical student or a trainee to get just started. And then they can, hopefully continue a journey of learning more and more about it. Do you want to introduce yourself and something relevant to this?
I'm John Bertoni, and I began medicine very interested in clinical work. I did some summer jobs working in laboratories, everything from cleaning out rat cages and dog cages to doing more refined things, mostly on the brain, some cardiology and vascular kind of work I did over the summers. But when I got to see patients for the first time, that's where my focus turned. I did some research on development of the brain, had a teacher investigator development award from the NIH. But once I got into clinical medicine, I used some of those techniques to solve clinical problems on patients. But what I do now is mostly patient-centered, and then mentoring and helping younger people, the students and the residents, get their foot in the door, like you say.
So I think from the get-go, we can divide research and explain that there is the bench research, which is lab, either with an animal or just with a petri dish, with a culture, and you're doing things with microscope and genetic testing and chemical reactions and whatnot. Then there is the clinical research where you're working with the patient, either with the patient data or patient themselves live and accumulating data. And then there is what is called a translational research, where a bench scientist comes in, works with a clinician to test their ideas on live patients. So you have to have a background in how that product was created, which is the bench researcher, and then a clinical application of it and measurement, and a translational research. I think we're probably going to focus mostly on the clinical research, not as much on the translational bench research, because that's, you need to have a lab, you need to have compounds and chemicals and animal models and things like that.
No, I think that's a good place to start, because most of us are really in this from the medical aspect as medical students and residents. We're seeing patients. That's what we're going to be doing. But to have the ability to advance knowledge enough so that we're helping patients more because of the, let's say, multi-center studies that we've been doing with the Movement Disorder Society or the Parkinson's Study Group, those kind of things are really gratifying.
Yeah. So, this idea for this talk came from this basic questions from a couple of medical students from my medical school. And they reached out to me and they said they need to understand how to get started with research, and not only just for themselves, but they wanted to create a program to help with all medical students and create a culture of research in medical school, which they saw missing.
All right. Well, there's a couple of approaches. I think if you have experts at your medical school that are inspiring to you and are doing good work and have openings or will let you work with them, you can see what they do from day to day. They can teach you some of the techniques that they have, and you can see how they use it and how do they expect that it's going to be helping patients. That's one way. Find a mentor, find somebody that's inspiring, that's doing really good work and is published, and they can show you the ropes, kind of how to get started. The other side of it, I think, if I can interject that here, if you run into an interesting patient that you are really learning about their illness or their whatever it is that they have, or deficiency state, whatever it may be, then you can learn how to study that patient and find other patients like them. For example, you find somebody with a low vitamin B1, and you really wonder, well, how did they get that? They're not the typical patient that we hear about. And then you find, well, maybe are there others like them, and you write a case report, a case series, and then sometimes I have actually found clinicians that might be good to measure, let's say ophthalmologists that can measure the visual problems with vitamin deficiency, let's say vitamin A deficiency or vitamin whatever deficiency. They can test to see if there's improvement with the patient.
Okay, so if I summarize, there are two main approaches. One, you can join someone who's already doing good clinical research and help them with what they're doing, and that will get you started, and you will be a lot of learning through that. Or the other approach is to find a burning question, something that really inspires you. It could be a patient case, it could be a patient question, it could be a medical care issue. And I just want to add that if you are in your first 2 years of medical school and you are only in classroom learning about anatomy and physiology, and you're wondering how am I going to get a clinical question, well, you can do rotations and electives. You don't have to bind yourself to what you're asked to do. You can reach out and say, I want to go to emergency room, or I want to shadow someone. You can reach out to someone in ophthalmology, neurology, cardiology, and say, can I shadow you? Can I see some clinics with you? Can I, in the afternoon, can I join you in the clinic? And that way you get exposed to a kind of patients that interest you early on, and that may immediately give you an idea. Either you will see an interesting case like you were saying, and you say, okay, wow, I didn't know that this existed, or this is very interesting to me, and you ask your clinical mentor a question about that, and if you feel there is a missing gap of information, and you go up online and look if there is an answer to that gap. If not, that you can make that a study question. So A, start with a question, something inspired you, or B, find someone already doing something and just join them to learn the ropes.
Right, and you know that some people go to medical school because there's been an illness of some type in the family, and that is an interesting thing to get them going on it. And if it's your passion, you should follow your passion. If you're really interested in something, go into it, head first. If you're taking courses and you're in the first couple of years of medical school, make sure you do well in those courses. But for the time off, if there's a summer off, make sure that you can do something that's going to advance your career and inspire you to work even harder.
We get students rotate with us, right?
Sure.
And we get requests for preceptorship or electives, and they are first year or second year medical school students. They want to just experience what the clinical neurology is like because they are interested in neurology early on.
Yes.
They may come in for 1 day or 2 days or maybe a week at a time. Maybe here at the med school they have a formalized program for them to do it, and maybe in other medical schools or in your medical school there is not a formal structure, but you probably can find half a day or 1 day free where you just don't have anything else to do or no classes, and you can take that opportunity. If you plan for it, we'll show up and go and visit a clinic.
Right. No, I think there are a lot of opportunities, and I think a medical school should provide opportunities.
Sure.
In other words, there's anything from what are the ethics you need to know about even animal research, and particularly for people. I mean, especially people that are ill or may not be mentally fully capable. There are rules you've got to follow, but basically you would treat them in general like you would like to be treated, but still there should be courses in that available, and in some techniques, and then later on how to write a good paper, how to write a good abstract, how to write a good proposal for funding.
So I want to get some guidance on both of these approaches a little bit before I move on to another question. One is that if someone decides I'm going to go for option A and find someone who's doing good research and join them, what's a way someone can find a good research in their institution or outside their institution?
Ask around. I mean, try to find out from anybody you can. I mean, I did things beginning with washing test tubes and just hanging out with people And they were doing, one of the things I did was we were studying a new hormone, erythropoietin. Nobody had ever heard of it before. And so they were trying to test, how do we know how much it's going to increase the red blood cell count? So what we did was we had lots of little mice, and my job was to put them into a hypobaric chamber to take them up to high altitude, so they were maximizing how many red cells they had. And then my job was to inject something that we took from a patient with, let's say, renal artery stenosis that was producing this hormone. How much was there? It was a bioassay. So we'd inject like 50 mice with this, and then we would see how much their hematocrits would go up. So, I mean, there's all sorts of things, but it's how do you take an idea and test it in the real world?
But here, like you're saying, that we're thinking about finding someone who's already doing good work.
Yes.
So by asking around, asking your seniors, if someone delivered a talk, walking up to them and saying, "Are you doing any research right now actively?"
Right.
If you are, if you know someone who is a resident in the program, in a ward, where let's say you want to do research in neurology, you can go to neurology ward and knock on the door, walk into the assistant professor or resident trainee and say, is there any research project going on around? And get an idea of different research projects and see if you can join one and learn the ropes by even washing the test tubes.
Yes, yes. You have to be careful, and you have to not talk too much. If you're just going to be standing there observing, and if you're doing it appropriately, then you can ask questions when the patient is out of the room, when you're not in the OR, whatever it is. The other way I found is when I heard a really outstanding lecture from a neurosurgeon. He was making lesions in the brain to take care of Parkinson's disease before we had deep brain stimulation. And I just went up to him and after a lecture, and he was telling me and showing me things, and I got in the OR with him and saw the big bank of not transistorized. This was way back when there were tubes. And I actually assisted him and changed the dials and did things that he wanted. And so if you know somebody, just go up, introduce yourself, and say, I'm interested. Do you need an extra hand? What can I do? And then as long as you are appropriate and they need somebody, they probably have a team where they're just looking for somebody to wash test tubes or whatever it is. But then you can sit in on the meetings and you can get into it and you can see how they're behaving. There's all sorts of ways. Now, there's probably better ways now, but ultimately you've got to interact with a person that knows a lot more than you and just let it soak in.
And I think when you start with it, you have to get your foot in the door, and you may have to take the most menial, meaningless job, but that's how you're being tested. If you show your persistence, if you show your patience, your interest, you know, a lot of people are not sure when you walk up to them, how serious are you? How reliable are you? How hardworking are you? Are you going to be a problem for them? Because, you know, their work is already going on. So they may test you for a while. They may give you something small. But if you persist, if you show up, then they will give you increasing tasks gradually once you prove yourself at every stage.
You have to be careful. You can be taken advantage of. But then again, when that person writes a note about you, because if you've worked with them, they'll write a letter of recommendation for you. And if you were always appropriate, always polite, always doing your job very well, and asking a lot of good questions, you want them to be able to say those kind of good things about you. I mean, that's not the reason. You're doing it because you love it, you want to learn things, but in the process, people will be impressed by your work ethic, about how well you interact with the group. All those things are very, very important. And I happen to know somebody in our medical school, but for the first couple of years, I spent my summers doing those kind of jobs. And then I just kept doing those things.
So I want to keep pointing out that as we talk through this, I think one important thing to always keep in mind is that why do research? Why is it so important? And we just actually touched on 3 important reasons. One, you might actually love it. You might actually enjoy it. You know, if you try it, you'll find out that it's really great. The second important thing is you get to know some really wonderful people. You network with them. You find out about more opportunity through them. And then thirdly, which is a practical importance, is that you might get a very good letter of recommendation. If somebody's doing a research, he might be an important person in his field or in the department or in the institution and may be recognized by other people. And you may get a good letter of recommendation rather than a generic letter that everybody else will get.
Right. Very, very true. I mean, anything you do, you got to do it with your whole heart, or else do something else. If you're not really into it, it'll be obvious to people, and they'll say, you know, he doesn't seem interested. He's not doing the hard work as well as the fun work. And so you want to be that person. You want to be the one that people would like you to work with them again the next year, or would like to give you more and more responsibility. And I think we all know what we're talking about here. You've got to give, and then you'll get.
So let's talk about the option B. Let's say that you are a curious mind and you do run into an interesting case,
right,
or an interesting questions. Actually, most interesting questions are triggered by that one patient.
Yes.
And then you start asking and see that you can generalize it to other patients and then to many patients. So how do you come up with a question? And how do you know this is an important, worthwhile question to pursue?
Okay, I'll try to give the Cliff Notes version of this. I was given by a resident that was leaving our program at University of Michigan this case. He says it's a spinocerebellar degeneration. And I said, oh boy, I want to learn about those. So I read about them, and this patient wasn't anything that was written about. And then I got the old record and I went into it, and I found out that at about 18 months of age, she had an abdominal catastrophe, and they had to remove almost all the small intestine. So then I started reading about the literature, and there is a rat model for vitamin E deficiency that caused what she had. She had a scoliosis, and there were other things wrong with her. So I got to noticing, and we got a vitamin E level that was hardly detectable. So then I had to figure out, well, how can I do something for this person? And then I found out that the other fat-soluble vitamins, vitamin A, her visual fields over the years have been found to start out normal and then get smaller and smaller and smaller with time. And there were people working with the ophthalmology department that I got on the case. And then I got a GI specialist on the case, and we had biopsies and we did other things. And then I got other people on the case, and we wrote up a protocol, had her come in, and we did all sorts of things.
So that was the first published case of vitamin E deficiency presenting with neurological problems,
right,
like ataxia in adults.
Yes.
How do you take that experience and generalize it? So what was it about this case that you think made it worthwhile pursuing or interesting to you?
Well, first of all, it was a fooler because a very good resident thought it was just a spinocerebellar degeneration. And you know what? So was vitamin B12 deficiency at one time. And eventually, okay, they have higher, they have all sorts of other changes. They got a neuropathy, they got ataxia. But they eventually found out that it was from lack of vitamin B12. And then they take it out of the spinocerebellar degeneration box. And so it's no longer thought to be one of those, but it really is. And so if you have a patient and you have an idea, well, look, we found a really low vitamin. How about if we check vitamin D, vitamin K, vitamin E, and we find out that those are abnormal too, and say, well, wait a minute, she looks just like these other patients. What if we give her all of these things and her visual fields went back toward normal? With enough, and I had an ophthalmologist making sure we gave the right doses.
So how do the students, generalize? How do they run into a case, and what can they do to figure out it's an interesting case?
Even in the first and second year, you can probably trail along with the rest of the team and see how things go.
Hello.
Hello. We're on camera.
All right. So we'll stop because we have audience.
Okay.
For the next.